Thank you, Hans. Like I said, I'm Alex Fries, and today I'm going to chat with you all about the symbols that we put on our maps here at the National Park Service. But more specifically, I actually want to talk about an effort that I've been leading for the past 9 months or so to remedy some discrepancies that have arisen over the years as the NPS Symbols library has continued to grow and evolve over time. Which is to say that NPS symbols, which we might sometimes take for granted as being this fully cohesive and unified symbol set, they're in fact just a little bit less cohesive than you might think, which makes sense when you consider the number of media groups that are in fact involved in creating and making use of them. So with that in mind, I do actually want to start off with a brief overview of how these NPS symbols came to be in the first place. And to do that, we have to rewind all the way back to the 1960s. Will you go? You will not go. Okay, there we go. And I say the 1960s because it's not exactly clear if they originated in either 1963 or 1966. I can't find exactly when. But regardless, around that time, the NPS went through this process of adopting a new and comprehensive standard for park signage. Now, as part of that effort, the agency hired a design firm out of New York to design 21 symbols that could be used to represent primary recreation activities. And while these symbols would indeed soon come to be adopted for use on park maps as well, I do think it's important to point out that they were originally designed specifically for use on park signage. Now, by the 1980s, this symbol library had expanded to 88 symbols. But also by this point, some problems had emerged with the original set. The symbols were relatively difficult to read from a distance. Some were already by then conceptually dated, and others were simply graphically inconsistent with one another. So you can see here, for example, that there are some noticeable geometry differences in how the figures on the left and the right are drawn. Now, all that said, this initial NPS symbol set still proved to be deeply impactful regardless of those drawbacks, and by the late 1970s, the Federal Highway Administration had adopted them in some form or another into their wider nationwide highway signage standards, regardless of the agency. Now, around that same time, another federal agency was also working to develop a symbol set for their own signage. And in 1971, the U.S. Department of Transportation commissioned the American Institute of Graphic Arts to study and potentially develop a new standardized symbol set that could be rolled out nationwide at various transportation facilities, particularly at airports. And in conducting their study, the AIGA studied a variety of existing symbol libraries from all across the world, including the NPS symbol library. However, their study ultimately led to the design and adoption of a completely new symbol set, which consisted of about 50 symbols, the vast majority of which are probably instantly recognizable to every person in this room, such as the ones that are shown here. They very quickly gained widespread acceptance, and not only in the United States, but in some form or another throughout the world. Now, moving on to the early 1980s, it was then the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers which sought to create their own symbol set for signage within their own recreation areas. And in doing so, they directed their commissioned designers to develop a symbology that followed the graphic style that was previously developed for the Department of Transportation symbols. However, given the recreational nature of the Army Corps symbols, they simultaneously used the designs of NPS symbols as their conceptual framework for making their own new symbols. Now, ultimately, this initial set of Army Corps symbols numbered at 88, including 15 that were directly taken from the Department of Transportation, and an additional 24 symbols were added later in 1987 to also cover various winter activities. But also in 1987, the Army Corps of Engineers placed their symbols in the public domain, with the intent being that these designs could thus be used by all public park and recreation agencies. And indeed, by the late 1990s and the early 2000s, the National Park Service itself was looking to adopt these newer symbols in place of the old 1960s era ones. And by 2006, the NPS's full adoption of the Army Corps symbol set was more or less complete. Now, that adoption did include the modification of about half the symbols to better accommodate the legibility requirements for maps. But of course, the story doesn't end there, because since that 2006 adoption of the 112 or so symbols, new symbols have been consistently added to the symbol library, including the ones that are shown here. And so as of 2023, there are now nearly 400 symbols within the combined symbol library among all the media groups throughout the National Park Service that make use of these symbols. So when I say NPS media groups, what exactly do I mean? Well, basically, for the purposes of this talk, there are three key players in the Park Service that design and then implement these symbols. The first of these, arguably, is the signs division, since, as you recall, the symbols were initially designed for them. It was only later that they would come to be adopted for use on NPS publication maps, which I'll call pubs for shorthand here. And from this side-by-side comparison, you can see that there are some geometry differences in the spacing of shapes and elements in the symbols to take into account the requirements for legibility on large signs versus very small print. And then a more recent player in the game is the NPS's digital mapping team, or NPMap. Their symbols began life essentially as a straight one-to-one copy of the publication symbols. And then further modifications were made to them to accommodate for their own particular needs. Instead of trying to read them on a small piece of paper, you now have to read them on a perhaps even smaller screen. Now, as you can see here across all three media types, this particular symbol, which represents a small boat launch, it remains the same, apart from those minor and necessary legibility changes that need to be made. And in full fairness, those consistencies are true for about 90% of that 400 symbol set. But for the other 10%, there are symbols for various subjects for which over time different media groups have developed completely different symbols to represent more or less the same thing. Now I have here just a few examples of such differences, and I've tried to find examples that illustrate some of the nuances in how these differences play out. So for example, at some point, both the signs team and the mapping teams ended up developing different symbols for video surveillance. In the middle, meanwhile, we have a case where the symbol for pit toilet and the newer NPMap team's library deviates from the publications version quite significantly. And then on the right, for the symbol representing a souvenir shop, digital mapping team also differs from their predecessor, at least maybe a little bit less harshly, but not quite, One could also look at the new symbol as more of an upgrade or facelift rather than a complete overhaul. So the question then arises, though, where would all these discrepancies have come from in the first place? And the truth is that there might not be a single answer to account for all of these differences that have come up over the years. But here's one way in which I have kind of imagined it might have happened. So if we start off with the original Army Corps of Engineers symbols, a request might come in from a park to create a symbol that represents a place to securely store food, presumably from wildlife. However, the Army Corps symbol set didn't actually have such a symbol, but it does have symbols in it from which graphical elements could be extracted or modified to make a new food storage symbol. So let's say that initial request came into the publications office. And so the mapping team was the first group to make their own take at that symbol. But sometime later, the signs division receives a similar request, and not knowing that publications has already made a symbol for food storage, they go about making their own version. And then some years later, when digital mapping comes along, they try adapting publications' existing symbol for food storage. However, they discovered that the intricacies of that particular design don't translate well to displaying on small screens, so further modifications are made to accommodate their particular needs. Now, before we continue, I have to again reiterate, out of nearly 400 symbols across all three media groups, the fact that less than 40 of them have any sort of differences at all is pretty remarkable. So I'd actually say altogether we're doing a pretty good job of keeping things consistent. But there's always room for improvement, right? And that's where I was asked to step in and see what we could do to trim down that 10% to be as small as possible. So that question arises, I suppose, how do you go about resolving those differences? Well, you make a spreadsheet. And I went through all the symbols across all three symbol libraries, and I tabulated two things. Whether or not a particular media group even has a symbol for the thing that's being represented, because not every media group needs to represent that thing. Sometimes you can just label it. And then two, if that symbol exists, are there any differences that are worth noting that need to be rectified? And then I went through all the instances of differences that I could come across, and I made a new document placing those different symbols side by side for immediate visual comparison. Now, this document was then sent out to all of the members of the brand new NPS Symbols group, which is comprised of all the individuals working within those media groups. And we currently sit at 8 members. 2 of them, I believe, are in here, in this room, in fact. And it was essentially used, this sheet was used to poll the opinions of each member of those media groups, seeing which versions of the discrepancies that they preferred and what comments or suggestions they might have. It was then left up to me, however, for whatever reason, to come up with recommendations for how to resolve each of these discrepancies that's outlined here. And this is also a good time to probably note that going forward, we're going to adopt a similar communication style to ensure that any future changes or additional symbols that are added to the 3 libraries remain in sync with one another. There's no point in going through and making that enormous spreadsheet all over again, if we don't address the root problem to begin with. So the goal is to finalize a sort of standard operating procedure that'll avoid having to go through this process ever again. So let's go back to those 3 examples that I highlighted earlier. And what exactly did I do to try resolving these differences? And full disclaimer, these are all proposals right now. None of this is finalized, so things could change. But starting off with that video camera on the left, overall I actually found myself liking the look and feel of the sign's take on the symbol more. However, I did find it odd how the supporting base for the camera on that symbol is like vertical, like it's on a stand and not mounted onto a wall, for example, which I think the maps symbol gets the point across. So what was my solution? I morphed them together. Yeah, I could probably use some more refinement. I admit I am not an artist, but I and the rest of the team, we seem to be, we at least think it was a step in the right direction. Now for that pit toilet symbol, in this case, the problem with the outhouse that's shown on the top is that it fails as a truly universal symbol. The cutout moon motif that's on the door of an outhouse, that's something that historically has only really been expressed in American pop culture. So it might not resonate in the same way, if at all, to a non-American audience. So I just proposed we get rid of it altogether and adopt the newer NP map version. And I do think this generally gets the point across more. The toilet doesn't flush. And in a similar vein, we do have some symbols within our library where the primary means of conveying the message is by inserting a short English word. We're also trying to move away from those. If you don't, English isn't your first language, you don't understand at all, how useful is that symbol, right? And then for the souvenir shop symbol on the right, to be honest, the first time I saw the one on the top, I thought it was a window. And I have a hunch that the digital mapping team might have felt similar about it, so at some point I went about overhauling their new symbol with a design or they went through the process rather of overhauling it by creating a new symbol design that while conveying a similar message, that of a gift box, I think, it does so with a newer design that is perhaps a bit clearer on that it's a gift box and not a window. So in this case, my decision was to pick the digital mapping version of the symbol. But I did change it slightly too. It's not a direct one-to-one replacement because I also rounded the corners on the gift box to make it feel more in line with the design language of the other symbols in our library. And that consideration was particularly important in this case because it's actually quite rare to see this symbol as a standalone symbol. It's in fact usually paired with a little book. We use it as the combined bookstore and souvenir shop symbol. And in this case, I think the rounded corners of the new gift box do make it fit in a little bit better, especially because the book that it's with also has rounded corners. But not every symbol lends itself to easy solutions. This is our Wi-Fi symbol. No, it's not. It's actually the NPS signage symbol for the amphitheater, but I like to call it the problem child because basically any person you ask who's not familiar with it already assumes it's Wi-Fi. And parks tell us all the time that people try to go to very remote places looking for Wi-Fi and can't find it. Alas. We've known that this symbol's been a problem for a while now, and we have tried to remedy it to some extent or another. Namely, on the mapping side of things, the one and only Tom Patterson, he did redesign the symbol at one point to look like this instead. The general feel of the symbol remains intact, but the lines representing the amphitheaters are, I guess, less curvy, you could say. And now that there's only 2 of them instead of 3, it's helped bring it further away from feeling and looking too similar to the more ubiquitous Wi-Fi symbol. So what's the problem then? Why don't we just adopt this for all media groups? Well, the problem is that this symbol's use actually goes beyond even the jurisdiction of the National Park Service now. So remember, I mentioned all the way back in the 1970s, the Federal Highway Administration adopted NPS signage as the official recreation symbols for use across the entire country. That rule still holds true, And while those symbols have over time been updated, at least from a design standpoint, to adopt the newer Army Corps of Engineers symbol standards, that also means that as a result, for the purposes of road signs at least, the NPS has no choice but to use this symbol, for better or worse, to convey amphitheaters. And at the time this symbol was designed, it was probably more than adequate to get the point across. But as we all know, times have changed, and until the Federal Highway Administration themselves look into replacing that symbol, this particular discrepancy might have to remain, at least for now. Well, that's all I have to show. I do, again, just want to reiterate that everything I've shown is still very much a work in progress, so anything and everything could still change before the final results come out. And I also, of course, have to thank everybody who's listed on here. And, oh, God, I didn't realize I added myself to that list. For providing invaluable feedback as I've worked to find and resolve these discrepancies. As always, if you have any questions or comments about what I've discussed, just feel free to, do not feel free to hesitate. Feel free to reach out to me during the conference or just email me here. So with that, thank you very much. And here's my obligatory cat photo that my cat sitter sent to me this morning. My cat does not like her sitter very much, so what can you do? Yeah, with that, if there's time for questions.
I think there's time for questions.
All right, yeah, thank you.
Any symbols you still feel stymied by that just seem incomprehensible to the public?
Ooh, any symbols that I feel stymied by, incomprehensible to the public. And I assume the amphitheater does not count as my...
That's one.
Yeah, I don't know, that's the one that always sticks out to me. All the other ones can be somewhat rectified or remedied, and we have the advantage of map legends, if nothing else. But that amphitheater, anyway, yeah. Yeah.
How many amphitheaters are there? That's a solution, just get rid of the amphitheater.
Yeah, how many amphitheaters are there? Yeah, that is a great question. Yeah, and like the few times that I've actually had one on a map, I've just labeled it amphitheater. Yeah, and I think that one in particular goes back to the fact that the symbols were originally designed for signs. So if you're driving along, a park road and, there's an amphitheater, or in this case, there's a Wi-Fi access point. I can milk this joke all day. Yeah.
Seems like for the amphitheater symbol, you could just add an aisle or two, and that would break up, then it would no longer look like the Wi-Fi.
You would think, but I guarantee you, I think it has been tried, yeah.
What was the suggestion? Just add an aisle, break the arcs with an aisle here, or two. It seems like that would work.
Or put people in the seats, put a ranger hat on.
Yeah, we have toyed with some like alternate designs internally. Yeah, it's just, at least from the signage standpoint, they can't budge on it, unfortunately.
Have you talked to the Federal Highway Administration?
I'm scared to.
Maybe they have the same problem. We're just pulling off our highways and,
Yeah.
Some of the symbols you did were sort of like the gift shop difference was sort of an oblique view as opposed to the sort of 2D graphic.
Yeah.
version. Did you all talk through whether to do that, why to do that, all that kind of?
Yeah, it's come up as a point of discussion from time to time. There are, I want to say there are some symbols from the Army Corps set that are also in that sort of oblique view, so there's precedent in it, at least from the original design language. Don't quote me on that, though. I could be completely wrong. But yeah, that did come up in conversation, I remember, for that one in particular. And I know, going back to the amphitheater, there has been discussion of perhaps making a new symbol that has a more oblique view. Again, nothing's been really done about it because it's, but yeah.
Thank you very much, Alex. Thank you very much, all of our speakers.